Pie in the Sky Media. This series contains adult language and descriptions of graphic violence throughout. Listener discretion is advised.
This was planned for months and months and months, and the steps they took not to get caught were elaborate and sophisticated and pretty friggin' smart. But it's like 95% genius, 5% dipshittery.
Welcome back to Criminal Mischief with Carolyn and Branden. You're listening to episode 123, part 2 of Wanton Cruelty. Now, if you haven't already listened to part 1 of Wanton Cruelty, go back to episode 122 in our Criminal Mischief feed or on our YouTube channel. But let's do a quick recap. 3 men abducted Michael, the owner of a successful pot dispensary, and his roommate Mary. They were forced into a van where they tortured Michael as they drove out into the desert. Along the way, the masked men demanded $1 million, believing Michael had buried that amount in the desert. When Michael couldn't produce the cash, one of the men severed his penis with a zip tie. He was rescued after Mary made an incredible sprint back to the main road in time to flag down a passing car. At first, investigators thought this was a home invasion gone horribly wrong, that maybe because Michael was a successful medical marijuana businessman, he had possibly wronged someone. But it was during a neighborhood canvass that investigators caught their first break.
There's neighbors on the other side of the alley, and they knock on one of those doors, and a woman answers the door who said, I did see something strange. I saw these boys with hard hats that appeared to be too new. She's like, it didn't look right to me, and it was a white truck and it had a dent on it. And they're like, please tell us you can give us some additional description. And she's like, well, I wrote the license plate down. Will that help? This was one of those breaks that, an investigation like this, I don't think we ever would have figured this out if it hadn't been for that.
That's Matt Murphy, former Orange County prosecutor and the author of The Book of Murder, a prosecutor's journey through love and death.
The license plate, when we ran it, it came back to a guy named Kyle Handley, and his license plate came right back to his house in Fountain Valley, California.
When they approached Kyle about the home invasion in Newport Beach, his response was to immediately ask for a lawyer. A search of Kyle's home revealed an attic that had been outfitted to grow marijuana.
The house was clearly being used as a grow house. So now we've got our first connection to the marijuana world.
And his truck?
They served a search warrant on it, and the first thing they do when they open the truck is they smell the overpowering odor of bleach.
They recovered a blue nitrile glove in the truck, and zip ties were found in a plastic bag in the backyard, which appeared to be consistent with the ones used to tie up Michael and Mary.
So we submitted the zip tie found on the trash bag for genetic testing, and we submitted this nitrile glove found in his truck for genetic testing.
Okay, you said 95% strategic thinking, 5% just idiocy. Why would they do this and him not clean out his truck? I mean, why do people do this? And then leave all this stuff in the house?
Well, the truck had been cleaned. The truck had been meticulously cleaned. Again, 95% genius. Let's clean the truck. Let's make sure there's no DNA in the truck at all. But then the gloves that they used to clean the truck, they left the gloves in the truck. So it's like 95% really smart, good idea. Let's clean up the truck just in case. And then they just kind of do this at the end of the thing, like pulling the gloves off and leave them there.
Investigators went back to Michael and asked him if he knew a Kyle Handley. And he's like, yes, I do.
Kyle had been a grower that Michael had purchased marijuana product from before.
Michael had met Kyle about 9 to 10 months before, and his business had had such a good year, he invited Kyle to celebrate in Las Vegas, along with some other growers. Kyle's connection to Michael and his truck and the other evidence they seized was enough for an arrest warrant, and the items seized would be sent to the lab, which would take a few weeks. But DNA finally came back on those gloves that were found in his truck.
Lo and behold, we get a hit on the nitrile glove to a guy named Hussein Nairi. The hot question at that moment was, where is Hussein Nairi? And we learned very quickly that he has fled back to his native country of Iran. So our mastermind, or who appears to be our mastermind, is in the one country in the world that will literally never extradite one of their citizens to the United States.
And the zip ties came back connected to an unknown male who was a different profile from Kyle or Nairi. They believe the contributor of that DNA profile was the third suspect. Investigators dug into Hussein Nairi's background. He lived in Newport Beach and had gone to high school with Kyle Handley. They had learned that Nairi had moved to California with his mom and brother from Iran, and descriptions of him included that he was well-spoken, intelligent, but reserved. After high school, Nairi joined the Marines, where he had a reputation of bristling against authority. 7 years before the kidnapping, Nairi was under the influence when he rolled his car, and his friend, who was with him, died. He was charged with vehicular manslaughter, but after he made bail, he fled to Iran. A year later, he snuck back into the United States, where he was later arrested on that outstanding warrant. But he would serve minimal time after pleading guilty and received a suspended sentence with time served and 5 years probation for that vehicular manslaughter charge.
He had a manslaughter conviction out of Central California. So he's committed a homicide in the past. And we also see that he's been the subject of more than one domestic violence investigation in the city of Irvine, which is right next to Newport. So we've got Kyle in custody. We've got unknown male DNA on the zip tie, and we've got a guy who looks like the heavy in a country where we're never going to be able to get him.
Another blow was that Kyle wasn't talking.
He's staring that down by himself, right?
He is. And Kyle, as they say, as detectives would say, the term is held his mud. He refused to speak, which is his constitutional right to do. He had no interest in, in cooperating at all. We were hoping that he would give everybody up, but he didn't. But the problem is, that means and he had a great lawyer, fantastic defense lawyer, who knows that in his client's best interest, he should have ratted everybody out and explain everything that happened, but he didn't. He refused to do that.
But investigators got another lucky break. The name Hussein Nairi was found in an SUV that had been involved in a high-speed chase in Newport Beach. Ultimately, the driver bailed from the SUV on Balboa Island and swam out of sight.
The driver got away. They didn't know who it was, but this name Hussein Nairi was in there.
That Chevy Tahoe was still an impound.
They go in and they search the Tahoe, and they find a bunch of surveillance, these mini little surveillance cameras inside the Tahoe. And as soon as they plugged those in and looked at the data on the cameras, it was Michael's house was the first image that appeared. So now we know that Nairi is putting surveillance cameras at Michael's home, watching him.
They didn't have Nairi, but the Tahoe represented a lifeline in the investigation because the owner of the SUV was Nairi's wife, Courtney Shagarian.
He's been the subject of more than one domestic violence investigation in the city of Irvine, which is right next to Newport, involving his wife, who is a law student named Courtney Shagarian. So now the house of cards begins to fall apart a little bit.
After the high-speed chase, Courtney reported her SUV as having been stolen. Armed with this information, investigators reached out to her under the auspices of the local police, letting her know that her property in the car was available for pickup. What she didn't know was that when she showed up, she was potentially walking into a trap. Because to get her things back, she'd have to sign a form acknowledging that all the possessions that were in that SUV belonged to her, which included electronic devices and GPS tracking equipment. What she didn't realize, even though she was a law student, was that by signing that these things belonged to her meant if she had anything to do with the crimes, she was automatically implicated in a case that could send her to prison for the rest of her life.
So she shows up and basically signs a form indicating that she is aware of all the contents and they belong to her, and she's essentially signs a document indicating that she was a full-blown co-conspirator, based on, they had her read it right in front of them, And
I mean,
so,
that was a checkmate move. Who
right.
orchestrated that? Because that's really powerful to get her to flip.
Yeah, really, really good detectives, and really good police work.
After Courtney signs the document, investigators pounce. They already have approved search warrants for her person, car, and house. They tell her your SUV was involved in a kidnapping, and they ask, "Who is Hossein Nayeri to you?" But Courtney wasn't forthcoming. She completely shut down and was uncooperative, and for the moment, she was free to go. They didn't have enough to charge her with anything. Meantime, detectives had pursued another line of inquiry, those cameras in the SUV. They had researched the serial numbers and were able to trace them back to a phony Yahoo account with an IP address that was connected to a business in Fresno called AgriGlobe.
They find a woman works there who knows Nayeri very well, named Naomi Rodas. And Naomi Rodas' ex-husband is a guy named Ryan Kevorkian. And again, we're still looking for this next guy.
The question remained, who was the third suspect? And also, how was Nayeri connected with Kyle, Naomi Rodas, and Ryan Kevorkian? But if there was one thing they were certain, it was highly unlikely that Nayeri would ever step foot back in the United States.
Kidnapping for the purpose of ransom, resulting in great bodily injury, it has a life without possibility of parole sentence, even in the state of California. And if you think about it, it should be. Like if you kidnap people for money and they wind up getting hurt, it should be life without possibility of parole. That's something that kidnappings for money tend to be calculated, they tend to be planned. And when somebody is in the process of calculating the costs and benefits of doing something like that, part of it should be, hey, if we do this, we better be really careful not to hurt the victim, because if they get hurt, we're doing LWOP, or life without possibility of parole. That's one of those laws that just makes sense. But under those circumstances, this guy's never coming back to America.
The conventional move at this point would have been to file charges against Nayeri and put an arrest warrant in the system that never expired. But this is when the lead detective, Ryan Peters, did something unconventional.
Ryan Peters was he's called the CAP, the Crimes Against Persons Sergeant at Newport PD. And this guy is like Joe Friday, but cooler. He's no nonsense. But he's also a dad. And so he starts looking into this. He sees the record of the domestic violence, and he sees that she's much younger than Nayeri. And we get a really good sense of who Nayeri is and how violent he can be. And look, he's a smart guy. And Kyle Hanley, on the other hand, is a friggin' stoner burnout. Like he is not the type who jumps out as the mastermind of a plan like this. And neither is Ryan Kevorkian. But Nayeri he's a marijuana grower. He's in the business. He's got a prior homicide conviction. He's smart. He's manipulative. He checks every box when you're looking for the heavy in something like this. So Ryan Peters, the detective sergeant, calls her dad, which is very unconventional, and says, "Hey, your daughter is up to her eyeballs in something that I think she's in way over her head, and this is a horrific crime, and I want just dad to dad, I want you to know about it." And it turns out that her family didn't even know that she'd married Hussein. They couldn't stand him. They saw him coming a mile away. He met her when she was 16 years old. And this was something that the family was completely in the dark.
Courtney's family immediately hired legal ace Lou Rosenblum.
They wind up hiring the best lawyer that could possibly come into this situation. And it's a man named Lou Rosenblum, who was the former head of homicide. He's the guy that recruited me into the unit I was working in, and he was my mentor. And the guy is a genius. The guy tried 67 murders as a deputy DA, as a line prosecutor in the homicide unit, and won every single one of them, which is impossible. It is absolutely impossible. But that's Lou. And Lou is one of these guys that he loves catching bad guys, but above all else, he's a do the right thing kind of guy.
After Courtney was reunited with her family, she stopped all communication with Nayeri, and Lou leveled with her. She had one option if she didn't want to spend the rest of her life in prison, and that was to tell the truth.
And Lou and Ryan Peters basically work out this plan where He's going to bring Courtney in for what's called a proffer, where she's going to tell us everything that she knows. That's carefully documented, carefully recorded, carefully provided to the defense. They have all that. And Lou sat down with her and me and my trial partner, Heather Brown, and Ryan Peters, and we basically just listen. And the idea that a proffer is, the idea with that is you get what's known as use immunity. In other words, the person, nothing they say in that interview can be used against them. You can still use all the other evidence you have against somebody. You just can't use what they say that day.
Hey, Criminal Mischief Nation. One great thing about having a big family is that if you're smart, you learn from your mistakes with your older kids. So when my youngest son, who's a tween, looks at my phone, it's so obvious he wants one of his own so desperately. Because a lot of his friends have them, and of course he sees his older teenage siblings with theirs. But I know from experience from my older kids that getting a phone before they're ready isn't always what it's cracked up to be. In fact, 45% of teens say social media makes them feel sad and depressed. I don't want that for my tween, which is why I love Gab, because I could get him a phone without all the risk that comes with unfiltered access. Gab is the leader in safe phones and watches for kids, tweens, and teens, because they don't come equipped with social media apps or an internet browser, but they do have GPS tracking. These devices are built specifically to keep kids safely connected. Gab phones have all the tech features kids actually want, like unlimited talk and text with Gab Messenger that also blocks out high-risk messages and content with nudity before ever reaching your child's phone in the first place. My son is 11 and has the Gab Phone 4 Pro, which has hundreds of screened third-party apps available to choose from. But mostly, I love it that he's happy, and I'm ecstatic that I can reach him if I need to, and that peace of mind, well, as they say, it's truly priceless. Protecting your kids has never been easier. For the best deals, sign up to Gab today. No contract required at gab.com/mischief. That's Gab, GABB.com/mischief. One more time, gab.com/mischief. Terms and conditions apply. 48 hours after Detective Peters made that unconventional call to Courtney's dad, she was sitting down at the Newport Beach police station with her attorney, Lou, and what she would say would blow the case wide open. Courtney confirmed that Hossein Nairi and Kyle Hanley were two of the men involved, and that the third man she only knew by the nickname Hossein had given him, Mr. Brown, a nod to the movie Reservoir Dogs.
We're going to be using aliases on this job. Under no circumstances do I want any one of you to relate to each other by your Christian names. And I don't want any talk about yourself personally. That includes where you've been, your wife's name, where you might have done time, or a bank maybe you robbed in, say, Petersburg. All I want you guys to talk about, if you have to, is what you're gonna do. That should do it. Here are your names. Mr. Brown, Mr. White, Mr. Blonde, Mr. Blue, Mr. Orange, Mr. Pink.
Courtney explained that Naomi Rodas and Ryan Kevorkian went to high school with Nairi, and that Nairi and Ryan had been really good friends. In fact, they both joined the military together. But it was Naomi who had purchased a 9mm handgun and a pump-action 12-gauge shotgun right before the home invasion, and she'd also rented a van.
They had a van that they hadn't rented, that nobody close to them had rented, that they got one of their ex-wives' friends rented in Central California to distance themselves as far as possible from this van.
And 7 months after this horrendous crime, Courtney finally shed some light on what led up to the kidnapping. She said that after Kyle returned from that Vegas trip with Michael, he just couldn't stop talking about how much money Michael had spent on expensive hotel suites, gambling, and entertainment, and that he'd paid for everything in cash. Now, at the time of Kyle's gushing, he and Nairi grew weed together, and had been for a while. And part of their process was that Kyle would be the one to sell that marijuana to Michael, but they weren't enjoying anywhere near the success that he was. The thing is that Kyle was pretty good at growing weed, but Nairi wasn't. And so when Kyle brought their crops to Michael, they believed it was the highest quality worthy of top dollar. But Michael didn't agree, and he wasn't willing to pay what they wanted. For him, it was a business decision. The quality just wasn't good enough. So when Kyle came back with less money to split, that made Nayeri angry. And that anger began to boil over when Kyle came back with tales of this extravagant Las Vegas trip. It incensed Nayeri because in his mind, Michael had dissed his product, paid him less than what he believed it was worth, and then he goes and plays the big shot in Las Vegas with all that cash. Investigators believe it was at this point that Nayeri decided to rob Michael, who he was convinced had loads of cash hidden somewhere. Because being in the business himself, he already knew that Michael couldn't just deposit the money at a bank because it was still federally illegal to sell marijuana. Nayeri, Kyle, and Ryan decide they are going to watch his every move. They place surveillance cameras on his home and his parents too. They also stick a GPS tracker on his car. This 24-hour surveillance goes on for months. Nayeri at the helm of this crew. He was already enraged with Michael, but as he watches him, he becomes obsessed. He is certain that Michael has $1 million. Now, where that specific figure came from is unclear, but Courtney explained it was the GPS tracker that led Nayeri to believe that Michael had buried his money in the desert. Nayeri saw that Michael's car had taken a trip out to the desert, where he just drove around in circles in one specific area. Apparently, Nayeri asked Courtney, why would someone go to this remote area and just keep circling around? And then Nayeri said, that's a perfect place for someone to bury a bunch of money. This idea gained momentum because Nayeri knew that a few weeks before, Michael had taken another trip to the desert. What Nayeri didn't know was that coincidentally, Michael's friend pitched a business venture which involved the possibility of mining minerals in the desert. But to a now manic Nayeri, this was all the proof he needed that $1 million was buried in the desert, and he had the GPS coordinates, and it was his for the taking. After Courtney's proffer, detectives began surveilling Ryan Kevorkian. They believed he could be their third suspect, but they'd need a DNA sample to compare it to the unknown profile recovered from that zip tie.
So the detectives go and they follow Kevorkian around. Kevorkian is a former CDC prison guard who has impregnated a female prisoner, which is frowned upon by the CDC, by the way. And he winds up losing his job, so he's unemployed. And so they follow him around, and he's a member of 24-Hour Fitness. And they follow him to the gym, and they snatch his gym towel. And lo and behold, his DNA matches the DNA on the zip tie. So now we've got all three guys.
But they don't really have all three. The mastermind, Nayeri, is still in the wind. Now, Lou Rosenblum believed Courtney was a victim of Nayeri's manipulations and coercive control. And now that she was back with her family, who he'd isolated her from, and in therapy, she told him she wanted to do whatever she could to make things right, which prompted Lou to reach out to investigators with a plan to get Nayeri back to the U.S.
Catch a really bad guy by luring him out of Iran, and at the same time saving the life of a young woman who is a victim. In Lou's eyes, she was a victim of Hussein Nayeri, and she was certainly a victim of domestic violence by him. You know, our thinking really was kind of, I was anything but sympathetic towards her at the beginning. And, you know, with Lou, and so we essentially gave her the opportunity to help the investigation by luring Nayeri out of Iran. And because she was a law student at the time, she was coming up on the bar exam, and she'd spoken with Nayeri's sister about going to Spain after the bar, and that was before any of this happened. So Lou and Ryan sent her up to his uncle's funeral to kind of, you know, reestablish herself with his family. I never thought this would work. I never thought that she, you know, there's a famous scene in the movie Heat when Ashley Judd comes out when Val Kilmer, after committing the bank robbery, you know, it's an ambush, and her house is full of police officers, and she just does one little like movement with her
on
finger.
the balcony.
Yeah, on the balcony, and he sees that and keeps driving.
The plan was set. Courtney would meet up with Nayeri in Spain, and she also promised to bring him $20,000 in cash and a new cell phone.
This took the better part of a year to like phone calls in Iran, and she's got to take the bar. And like this took so much time. Meanwhile, Lou and her family have her in therapy, and the idea is redeem her, give her a second chance, and catch this bad guy. I've never been involved in anything quite like this. In fact, I've never been involved in anything remotely like this. So again,
Do
conventional
you
movie.
think that you were involved in it because of your respect for Lou? Like you were willing to extend, like you said, you really didn't like her at first because you thought she was probably involved in it, right?
Only reason that woman, Courtney Shigerian, is free today is because of her lawyer. He got us all to rethink this. I mean, Ryan Peters too, and her father, but her lawyer is the one guy that everybody universally respected, who's going to come in and say, absolutely, what she did was bad, but here's how he treated her, and here's the cycle of violence that she was involved in, and here's how manipulative he is. And I mean, we went from not being fans to, really kind of seeing it in that light.
Everything was planned for this meetup in Spain, but there was a pretty big hiccup.
Perfect. We'll fly him into Spain, and Spain will cooperate. And I got a real education on that. Like, the UK is terrible for extradition, kind of counterintuitive. And turns out they've got a bunch of our child molesters that are living freely in the UK. Don't know what you're thinking over there if anybody's watching, but there are dozens of sex offenders who fled to the United Kingdom for whatever reason, and they won't extradite. France won't extradite, or they're very difficult with extradition. Turns out the former Soviet bloc, all those countries like Estonia and Poland, the Czech Republic, they will extradite. They love America. They admire our legal system, believe it or not, and they trust our system to be fair compared to what they had in the former Soviet bloc. They kind of get it.
The tickets booked had a layover in the Czech Republic. When Nairi landed in Prague, he was immediately arrested. It would take about 6 to 8 months to finally extradite Nairi back to the United States. This was roughly a year and a half since the home invasion and torture. But the case against Nairi was strong, and now that he was in custody, it seemed like all of their hard work was starting to pay off. Until 3 weeks before the trial, they got the news that 37-year-old Hossein Nairi had escaped from jail with 2 other inmates. Investigators had spent a year and a half hunting Nairi, and now they were fearful that he was coming after them.
I get the call that Nairi, they've done a prisoner count, and he is missing. And he has escaped from the Orange County jail. And he left my photo and Heather Brown, my trial partner, and one of my best friends, our photos were left on his bunk, which was the biggest FU. And I heard a good word the other day, you hear it every once in a while, apoplectic. Describes, like, we go through all this to catch this guy, and the Orange County jail classified him with what's known as a white band, which means he's least dangerous, least likely to offend. This is a guy with a homicide conviction in his background. It was a manslaughter, but he's got a freaking homicide. And they put him in a dorm with like 40 other guys, and he tunneled through one of the grates.
Once you charge someone, the prosecution turns over everything to the defense related to the investigation, which meant Nairi was fully aware of Courtney's role in luring him back to the United States when he escaped. She was terrified that he would come and take his revenge against her. The obvious assumption was that Nairi would flee south to Mexico, but instead he went north.
All he needed to do was go south. And there's, in Southern California, especially Orange County, you're about 2 hours away from the Mexican border. Just south of the border, after you enter Tijuana, there is about 15 minutes from the border, there's a full-blown Iranian embassy. And all he needed to do was go south to the embassy. And it's about 2 hours away, and he'd been missing for 18 hours before they even knew it.
A week after the escape, a man on the street had just finished reading the newspaper, where he'd seen a story about these escapees along with their mugshots. And just a few minutes later, he saw what appeared to be Hossein Nairi stepping out of the back of a van.
He was found ultimately smoking weed in a van.
After Nairi's recapture, the prosecution was shocked when his defense released a 15-minute video showcasing his escape from jail in an effort to soften his image to a potential jury pool.
And you talk about the arrogance. He smuggled a cell phone into the jail and filmed it. He videoed his own escape.
Nairi, using a page from the Escape from Alcatraz playbook, was somehow able to get a hacksaw blade smuggled into the jail. And once again, he became the ringleader of 2 other inmates who were part of the escape plot. I should mention, this was a dormitory with a bunch of other inmates. Imagine rows of stacked bunk beds jam-packed with prisoners in a big open room. And it's pretty unbelievable that no one rats him out as he's sawing through the metal grate by his bunk. A piece large enough for him to shimmy through, and something he can maneuver back into place because the job's going to take some time. Behind the grate, there was a plumbing tunnel and a series of bars which they'd have to saw through. Then, using a ladder made from bed sheets, they climbed out a hatch and onto the roof. They then rappelled 4 stories down to the ground and walked away from the Orange County Jail. The 15-minute montage of the escape was set to the theme song from Mission Impossible. In July 2019, 7 years after the crime, Hossein Nairi would finally stand trial. He would testify in his own defense, proclaiming he was innocent of all charges, that the only reason he had footage of Michael's home was because Kyle had paid him to do legitimate surveillance work on Michael. Nairi was even able to muster tears on the stand multiple times and appeared to be gaining sympathy from some of the jury members. He insisted he was being railroaded by the police and prosecutors. But everything changed when the prosecution had their shot. 2 minutes into Matt's cross-examination, when he established the pecking order and that Nairi wasn't on top, things exploded.
I'm asking the questions.
No,
Mr.
I don't
Nairi.
remember.
Look, man, you gotta answer the questions or not.
Nairi was walking into Matt's trap. It's exactly what he wanted him to do, was to reveal his true personality, so they could see the real, evil, angry, and narcissistic nature of this man. A window into what he did in the back of the van with Michael and in the desert when he wasn't getting what he wanted. Here's a clip from ABC News that captured Matt's final question to Nairi during his cross-examination.
Just got one last question for you. You're out in the desert with Michael and you cut off his penis. Why couldn't you just leave it there in the hopes that it could be reattached? You want to give us an answer for that?
Nairi stared Matt down with intense hatred.
I want to give you an answer for that, personally.
This is exactly what Matt wanted, Nairi threatening him in open court. But it wasn't just that. It was the way Nairi knocked back his head just a bit, in a knowing kind of way, as he stares at Matt in a controlled, determined, stone-cold, I'm going to get even kind of way.
Personally, I'm done. So he said. I'm done? What does that mean, Mr. Nairi?
I said, are you done?
So my question to you...
I'm not going to even answer your question.
Okay.
You don't even deserve an answer with that.
Okay.
Nice try.
It would take 5 long days for the verdict to come in.
We alleged that he was the actual cutter, and we had information from Ryan Kevorkian, who did roll, who was there, who said Nairi was actually severed the penis. But we decided not to call him, mostly because I thought that what he did was so bad, I didn't want to give him a deal commensurate with testimony. That was a tough question for the jury. I don't think they ever really had a problem with him being one of the people. I think they struggled over that one thing because the evidence was, we really thought it was there circumstantially, but he ultimately was not convicted of that. But everything else, and the thing is, we alleged it, but we didn't actually need it for the purposes of sentencing, because he was, whether he was the van driver or the person torturing him in the back, he was one of the kidnappers that resulted in great bodily injury. I have no doubt, subjectively in my mind, that he was the one that actually severed the penis.
Hossein Nairi would receive a life sentence without the possibility of parole. And as for Nairi's other co-conspirators, Naomi Rodas pleaded guilty to being an accessory after the fact. She was sentenced to 3 years of informal probation. Ryan Kevorkian pleaded guilty to kidnapping, burglary, and assault, and was sentenced to more than 12 years in state prison. And Kyle Handley was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Up next, Criminal Mischief bonus content. Here, my co-host Branden Morgan and I discuss the case in more detail. And hey, guess what? We're on YouTube. So go check us out and subscribe to the show. And as always, thanks for listening. From Cloud 10, Criminal Mischief is a pie-in-the-sky production recorded in the beautiful Pacific Northwest. We're produced by Branden Morgan and myself, music by Soundstripe. I'm Carolyn Osorio, your writer and host.